My own funeral was a surprisingly tasteful affair, right up until I, the guest of honor, decided to walk down the aisle. But before I was the ghost at my own memorial, I was just a girl named Ava Vance, raised in the manicured silence of a Lake Forest estate just north of Chicago. Our house wasn't so much a home as it was a stage, a sprawling brick facade with ivy that clung to it like a well-kept secret. In our world, the sound of sprinklers on a perfect green lawn was the metronome that kept our perfect, polished lives in rhythm. My father, Arthur Vance, was a titan of industry, a man who saw the world as a balance sheet and people as assets or liabilities. My mother, Eleanor, was the curator of our family's flawless public image. Her smile was a masterpiece of social engineering, and her opinions were simply reflections of my father's latest stock performance. For 19 years, I was their star asset. I was the daughter who got the grades that led to early acceptance at Yale, the one who played cello with just enough passion to impress their friends at holiday gatherings, the one who wore the right clothes and smiled the right smiles. I was the continuation of the Vance dynasty. The life they had designed for me was a blueprint for success, meticulously drawn. I would attend Yale for economics, then the Wharton School for my MBA. My summers would be spent in unpaid internships at my father's multinational corporation. I would be a vice president by the time I was 30, and I would eventually marry the son of another Chicago dynasty, a young man whose ambition was dwarfed only by his family's fortune. It was a life of extraordinary privilege, and it felt like a slow, elegant execution. My own dream was something far less elegant. It was messy and loud, smelling of roasting garlic and simmering stock. I wanted to be a chef. I dreamed of the brutal, beautiful ballet of a professional kitchen, the hiss of a pan, the rhythmic thud of a knife against a well-worn cutting board. I wanted to create something real, something that could offer a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. I had secretly applied to the Culinary Institute of America in Hyde Park, New York, and I had been accepted. For years, I had been siphoning off birthday money and cash from a quiet job at a local library, building a small escape fund I kept hidden in a hollowed-out book on my shelf. The day I chose to tell them about my future was the day they chose to delete me from theirs. I chose to make my announcement during Sunday brunch, the most performative meal of our week. The dining room was a museum of inherited silver and crystal, smelling of my mother's expensive floral arrangements and the faint scent of lemon polish. I placed my acceptance letter from the culinary school on the table right next to the sterling silver salt cellar. I saw it as a declaration of independence, a plea for them to finally acknowledge the person I was, not the corporate heir they were grooming. My father didn't touch the letter. His gaze, usually apathetic, sharpened on me with a cold, analytical fury. He looked at me as if I were a line item on a budget that had suddenly gone into the red. A chef? The word was an insult, delivered with a quiet, dismissive sneer. You want to trade a legacy for an apron? You are a Vance. We don't serve. We are served. I tried to articulate my passion. I spoke of creation, of artistry, of building something with my own two hands. My words were just static to him, the meaningless babble of a faulty product. We did not invest 2 decades of our lives, of our resources, to have you become a line cook, he said, his voice dangerously low. We gave you every conceivable advantage, and you choose to squander it on this blue-collar fantasy? I looked to my mother, my last court of appeal. I pleaded with her eyes, begging her to see me, to defend me, to offer a single shred of maternal support. She sat perfectly upright on her needlepoint chair, her hands resting in her lap. She didn't look at me. She simply reached out and smoothed a non-existent wrinkle on the starched linen tablecloth, a small, precise gesture of erasure. She was tidying me away. Then my father issued his final judgment. He stood casting a long shadow over the brunch table. If you walk out that door to pursue this nonsense, he stated, his voice as cold and final as a signed contract, then you walk out of this family. As of that moment, you cease to exist for us. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. I kept waiting for a flicker of emotion, for someone to raise their voice, for a tear. There was only the cold, transactional finality of his decision. Leave, he said, his voice flat, turning his attention back to his eggs Benedict as if our conversation was concluded. I was paralyzed for a moment, my breath caught in my chest. A cold wave of panic washed over me. He pointed a fork toward the grand foyer. Now! My mother never looked up, a silent, complicit partner in my banishment. They didn't let me get my purse or my coat. They didn't let me go to my room for the hollowed-out book with my life savings. I walked out of that mansion with my phone, my driver's license, and the $96 in my pocket. Every step on that polished marble floor felt like I was wading through ice water. I glanced back one last time, searching my mother's face for anything, a hint of regret, a flicker of love. There was nothing. She was a statue, observing a minor, unpleasant business matter being resolved. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, and the sound of the deadbolt was the sound of my life being liquidated. Just like that, I was 19 and utterly alone. The first year was a nightmare of shame and fear. I bounced between the couches of a few high school friends, but their parents' pity came with an expiration date. I was a fascinating cautionary tale for their own children, but not a permanent house guest. Soon enough, the texts went unanswered. The offers to stay another night stopped coming. I ran out of couches and found myself cast out of the clean, quiet suburbs and into the harsh reality of the city my parents had always pretended didn't exist. I ended up at a women's shelter in the city. I would lie awake on a thin mattress that smelled of disinfectant, listening to the quiet sobs and weary coughs of the other women whose lives had also been shattered. I learned how to be small, how to be invisible. It was a survival tactic. I took any work I could get. I washed dishes in a 24-hour diner, my hands permanently raw and red. I worked the graveyard shift stocking shelves in a cavernous supermarket, the drone of the fluorescent lights a constant hum in my skull. I cleaned the bathrooms in downtown office buildings late at night, scrubbing the toilets for men who lived the life my father had demanded for me. Every dollar I earned was a small victory, a tiny piece of myself I was buying back. I survived on instant noodles and stale pastries from the diner, saving every possible penny. It was a soul-crushing, relentless grind, but it didn't extinguish the fire in me. It focused it. Their cruelty was designed to break me, to force me to crawl back. Instead, it forged me into something hard and resilient. I made a silent vow to myself every night in that shelter. They would not write my ending. 3 years went by, 3 years of clawing my way out of the hole they had thrown me in. I worked my way up from dishwasher to prep cook at a bustling neighborhood bistro. I saved enough to rent a tiny, dilapidated studio apartment in a loud, chaotic part of town. The plaster was cracked and the pipes groaned, but it was mine. I had built it from the wreckage of the life they had torched. The wounds were finally beginning to scar over. I was beginning to feel human again. And then the universe decided to remind me that I was still a ghost. I had managed to save over $8,000, a sum that felt like a king's ransom. It was time for another step toward normalcy. Opening a proper bank account. I walked into a downtown bank branch, filled with a sense of pride that was foreign and new. I sat down with a cheerful young banker and presented my driver's license and social security card. She tapped my information into her system. Her professional smile wavered. She squinted at the screen, her brow furrowed. She typed my social security number again. She looked up at me, then back at her monitor, her cheerful demeanor evaporating into confusion. "Is everything all right?" I asked, a familiar knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. "Just one moment," she said, her voice strained. She hurried over to her manager's desk. I watched them exchange hushed words, both of them casting quick, nervous glances in my direction. My blood turned to ice. The manager, a stern woman with a severe haircut, walked over to the desk. She looked from her computer screen to my face, her expression a strange mix of pity and suspicion. "Ma'am," she said, her voice low, "I'm sorry, but we have a significant discrepancy in your file. According to the Social Security Administration, the owner of this Social Security number is deceased." I let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Deceased? That's ridiculous. I'm sitting right here. It must be some kind of typo." The manager shook her head, her expression grim. "This is not a typo, miss. This is an official government record. As far as the United States government is concerned, Ava Vance died nearly 2 years ago." My world tilted on its axis. The following days were a descent into a bureaucratic hell. I was bounced between government agencies, a living person trying to convince a series of indifferent clerks that I was not, in fact, dead. The final damning piece of evidence emerged at the Cook County Records Office. A sympathetic employee, sensing my desperation, printed me a copy of an official state-certified death certificate. There it was in cold black ink. My name, my birth date, and in the box labeled informants, 2 names, Arthur Vance and Eleanor Vance. They hadn't just disowned me, they had officially killed me. The sheer calculated evil of it was breathtaking. Why? Why would they do something so monstrous, so permanent? The clerk, seeing the look on my face, handed me another printout. "I found this in the online archives of a local paper," she said softly. "This might explain some things." It was my obituary. It spun a beautiful, tragic tale of their cherished daughter, a brilliant Yale student who had died in a tragic boating accident off the coast of Maine during a summer holiday. It was a lie, a carefully constructed fiction designed to elicit sympathy and, more importantly, to close the book on me forever. And there, at the bottom of the article, was a small notice. A memorial service would be held the following Saturday at St. Michael's Chapel on the lakefront, the very same church where I had been christened. As the initial shock subsided, it was replaced by a cold, diamond-hard rage. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. My father was a man of transactions. I remembered the substantial life insurance policy he had insisted I sign when I turned 18, calling it prudent estate planning. I remembered the trust my grandmother had left for me, which would pay out on my 25th birthday or upon my death. He hadn't just written me off, he had cashed me out. That Saturday, I wore the only nice dress I owned, a simple black sheath I'd bought at a thrift store for job interviews. I took my time with my hair and makeup, something I hadn't bothered with in years. I looked at the reflection in my cracked bathroom mirror and saw a different woman from the girl they had cast out. She was harder, thinner, and there was a dangerous fire in her eyes. I wasn't dressing for a funeral, I was dressing for a resurrection. I pushed open the heavy, ornate doors of the chapel. The air was thick with the suffocating scent of white lilies, the official flower of my mother's performative grief. The pews were filled with faces from my old life, my aunts and uncles, my father's business associates, their perfectly coiffed wives who used to praise my cello skills. They were all there, dabbing at their eyes, murmuring about the terrible tragedy. And there, at the front of the church, standing next to a large, softly lit portrait of me from my high school graduation, was my father. He was delivering my eulogy. His voice was thick with manufactured emotion as he spoke of my adventurous spirit and the unfathomable hole my death had left in their lives. In the front pew, my mother was giving the performance of her life, her face a mask of noble sorrow, a silk handkerchief clutched in her hand. The same woman who had watched me walk out into the world with nothing was now weeping for a crowd. I let him finish. I let him bask in the sympathy of the congregation. When he choked out his final line, "We will carry our precious Ava in our hearts forever," and the organ began to play a mournful dirge, I began my walk. I started down the center aisle. The sharp click of my heels on the stone floor was the only sound that cut through the music. A few heads turned, then more. A low murmur started at the back of the chapel and spread like a virus. The whispers grew, then died, replaced by a collective gasp. The organ music faltered, then stopped with a wheezing groan. Every eye in that church was on me. Faces of polite sadness twisted into confusion, then disbelief, then abject horror. My father, who had been turning from the lectern, froze. The color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly gray. He was staring at a ghost. My mother looked up, and her mask of grief didn't just crack, it disintegrated. A small, strangled whimper escaped her lips. Someone in the pews shrieked. That single sound broke the spell. The chapel erupted into chaos. There were gasps, panicked whispers of, "What is going on? And is that her?" People were physically recoiling from me as I passed. My father gripped the lectern to steady himself, his knuckles white. For the first time in my life, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Not anger, not disappointment, pure, primal terror. His perfectly curated world was collapsing in on itself, in front of everyone whose opinion he valued. I stopped a few yards from the altar, letting the silence hang in the air. I let them all get a good long look at the living proof of their lie. I tilted my head, offering a small, sharp smile that held no warmth. "I hope I'm not too late," I said, my voice clear and steady, ringing through the cavernous space. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." The room buzzed with frantic energy. "Arthur, Eleanor?" my Aunt Susan called out, her voice trembling. "What is the meaning of this? We thought Ava was—" Her voice faded as she looked from my parents' horrified faces to mine. My father tried to regain his composure, hissing at me under his breath, "You have no business being here." I laughed, a short, brittle sound. "No business? At my own memorial? I'm the guest of honor." I raised my voice to address the entire bewildered audience. "I'm sure you're all a bit confused. It's difficult to mourn someone properly when they're standing right in front of you, especially when their own parents had them declared legally dead to fraudulently collect on a life insurance policy." A single unified gasp swept through the church. You could almost hear the gears turning in 100 minds. The looks of confusion turned to dawning comprehension, then to disgust, all of it aimed at the man at the lectern. "They threw me out 3 years ago with nothing," I continued, my voice gaining strength from years of suppressed rage. "They left me to survive on my own, but I suppose just disowning me wasn't final enough for their accounting, so they decided to have me killed, on paper anyway. I locked my eyes on my father. Why don't you tell them, Arthur? Why go to all this trouble? Was Grandma's trust fund the real prize? Tell them. What's the going rate for liquidating your only child?" His composure finally shattered. The mask of the grieving father, the respected businessman, the pillar of the community, it all turned to dust, revealing the cold, calculating monster beneath. "You were a bad investment," he roared, his voice booming sacrilegiously through the chapel. "An asset that refused to perform. I wrote you off. It was a business decision." The silence that followed his confession was absolute, more damning than anything I could have ever said. He had convicted himself with his own words in a house of worship in front of his entire world. I saw the glow of cell phone screens begin to pop up around the room. The whispers were no longer confused. They were outraged. He admitted it. Call the police. They didn't have to. 2 uniformed officers were already walking up the center aisle, their calm, steady presence an undeniable omen. My father saw them, and all the fight drained out of him. He slumped against the lectern, a man utterly and finally defeated. He said nothing as they reached him, informed him he was under arrest for insurance fraud and conspiracy, and snapped handcuffs around his wrists. He refused to look at me. He didn't even glance at my mother, who sat frozen in the front row, a living statue in the ruins of her life. As the officers led my father away, I turned my back on all of it. I walked back down the aisle, through the crowd that parted for me like I was a force of nature, and out into the bright, cold sunlight. For the first time in 3 long years, the crushing weight I had carried every second of every day began to evaporate. They had tried to steal my life, to edit my story, to write my end, but they had failed. Standing on the steps of that church, I took a deep, clean breath of freedom. This wasn't the end of their story. It was the first page of mine. My name is Ava Vance, and my story is just beginning.